This joint hearing between the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact and the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, the Environment, and Cyber will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for our hearing entitled Preparing for COP26, United States Strategy to Combat Climate Change Through International Development. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after speaking. Consistent with the remote committee proceedings of HRES 8, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Again, thank you all for joining today's hearing on the role America's international development programs can play in combating global climate change. This November, the world's leaders will converge on Scotland for the United Nations COP26 Summit on Climate Action. The stakes couldn't be higher. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report this year indicates that we need to be far more ambitious in reducing emissions from fossil fuels that are causing the climate crisis. When President Biden goes to Glasgow on a diplomatic mission to convince our partners and adversaries to step up, he will need a clear vision for what the United States and the world must do. First, I hope we can reach an agreement on the President's Build Back Better Act before the end of the month so he can negotiate from a position of strength and a strong set of commitments for climate action by the United States at home. But the witnesses here today will be able to speak to the other part of the President's agenda, what we will be doing globally through our development programs to help the world reduce its carbon emissions and build resilience against a changing climate. During this hearing, I hope we will discuss the goals of our development programs and what we're looking to achieve. I'd like to hear about how USAID, DFC, and MCC are each balancing their work between climate mitigation, by that I mean reducing carbon emissions, and resilience or adaptation. I strongly believe that combating climate change is critical to effective development outcomes. If we fail to take climate into account in our development projects, the roads we build will be washed away during the next hurricane season. Not taking climate into account leads to less sustainable results. In short, international development is climate policy, and I look forward to your testimony today. I hope the witnesses speak to how their respective organizations define climate-related work and speak to how a changing climate will affect development outcomes. I called this hearing to get a better sense of what the administration's policy will be on, for example, the financing of fossil fuel projects abroad and where they see trade-offs, if at all, between climate goals and development outcomes. And I'm encouraged by the decision to limit the deployment of new fossil fuel projects, but we need clarity on when, where, and under what circumstances this will occur. USAID, DFC, and MCC have powerful tools to lend towards addressing climate change. The witnesses today will speak to how their agencies can contribute towards the President, Congress, and the United States goals at COP26. With that, I'll now turn it over to Ranking Member Malliotakis for her opening remarks, and then recognize Chairman Keating and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick for their opening remarks. Ranking Member Malliotakis, please.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, and thank you, Chairman Keating, for holding today's hearing. And let me begin by saying that my constituents who have been devastated by Hurricane Sandy and recently by Ida have seen firsthand the rising intensity and frequency of storms in our country, and they know that the impact of climate change is real. Fortunately, the United States has been at the forefront of the fight to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions while simultaneously promoting energy efficiency. Our progress in this regard is clear. Since 2011, the share of renewably sourced American electricity has more than doubled from 5% of our total production to over 12%. And since 2005, our power sector emissions have fallen by over 37%, a result of increased investment in renewable energy and Americans making eco-friendly choices each and every day. Yet while our country continues to make climate progress, the world's most destructive polluter stands out as the People's Republic of China, a nation responsible for almost 30% of global emissions. That said, President Biden's key international climate decision to date has only emboldened China's carbon emissions spree. In rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, a toothless agreement which let the Communist Chinese claim developing nation status, he has explicitly assented to China's unchecked and deadly pollution of our atmosphere. What's worse is that he rejoined the Paris Agreement without securing any real commitments from the Chinese Communist Party to ensure their actions would change. Now, in an attempt to clean up China's literal mess, the administration has taken to tying the hands of American businesses, ignoring the fact that even our best efforts will not offset the climate damage caused by countries like China and Russia. A prime example is President Biden's decision to shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, an efficient gas pipeline system which would have allowed us to benefit from access to high-quality Canadian oil. Americans are now paying for Biden's decision at the gas pump, with prices pushing $5 a gallon in blue states like California. Even more confounding is the fact that the Biden administration greenlighted Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a decision which not only flies in the face of the president's supposed rationale for shutting down Keystone XL, but one that will make our allies in Europe more reliant on Russian energy. And we're seeing that now. And I can go on, but the inconsistency in Biden's international climate policy should be evident to all of us. Mr. Chairman, we also witness to China imposing their worthless environmental standards across continents, building ports, coal-fired power plants, and other critical infrastructure projects with little to no environmental oversight in developing nations around the world. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has set unrealistic goals, benchmarks, and restrictions for our development agencies to juggle in pursuit of climate-related targets. This administration must consider the reality that countries with low energy access are not the leading greenhouse gas emitters, and that countries like Russia and China are. Our priority should be increasing access to all available energy sources to reduce energy poverty and spur economic growth in the United States and around the world. Wind and solar are important, but they cannot be the only options. As the Biden administration looks to the UN Climate Change Conference next month, Congress must conduct rigorous oversight of any commitments made by the president to other nations. And if the administration is going to engage in a global framework on climate, it needs to actually hold countries like China accountable for polluting to the extent that my own constituents must prepare for rising seawaters, which threaten their homeland and their homes and their livelihoods. Mr. Chairman, while we work to achieve a sustainable future, we need to carefully weigh the impacts of going all in on alternative energy, especially while our adversaries stand by and simply watch. With that, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Malliotakis. I'll now recognize Chairman Keating, who heads up the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy and the Environment, and Cyber. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From October 31st to November 12th, the United Nations will host its 26th annual Climate Change Conference, commonly known as the COP26 Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. This historic event will bring together world leaders to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The summit will identify ways governments, businesses, and civil society can work together to transform the ways we need to tackle the climate crisis. I'm hopeful that the COP26 summit will address one avenue of combating climate crisis in particular: climate development program and financial assistance. Climate change is inexorably tied to poverty and economic growth, and we must invest now to counter its dire consequences, as well as support new and emerging technologies in the green industry sector. As we rise to meet the existential threat of climate change, we must be bold and leverage innovative solutions. The anticipation of COP26 and the international development's critical role in the fight against climate change inspired Chair Castro, Ranking Member Malliotakis, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and I to organize this hearing today, where we'll look and seek better understanding of the current state of U.S. agency operations and foreign assistance and programming with respect to mitigating the sources and adapt the effects of climate change. Before I continue with my opening statement, I'd like to offer my thanks to you and your staff, Chair Castro, for organizing this hearing today. I commend your steadfast efforts to highlight these critically important issues, and I look forward to continuing our work together during this Congress. Let me now turn to the topic we're all here today to discuss. I'm incredibly excited to hear from our expert witnesses today about their agency strategies to advance the Biden administration's objectives to lessen the effects of global climate through international development. This is a unique opportunity to hear from our leading development organizations on their international strategies on combating climate change before President Biden and other world leaders meet to coordinate global action on climate at COP26. Since President Biden announced his climate strategy earlier this year, USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the International Development Finance Corporation have been working tirelessly to develop plans that will guide efforts to target climate change resources strategically, to ramp up climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, and to further integrate climate change considerations into international development and assistance programs across all sectors. I continue to be encouraged and supportive of the administration's commitment to tackle the climate crisis utilizing all resources available. Now is the time to back up our commitments through the implementation of development and assistance programs that will have a lasting and meaningful impact on the safety and well-being of our global communities. Our international climate development work should focus on mitigating the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events, provide humanitarian and disaster assistance, and build climate-resilient communities around the world in a fair and equitable manner. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to discuss those principles and other crucial components of climate development assistance, to include how the U.S. and our transatlantic allies plan to coordinate and balance climate goals and development work. Combating climate change and development program should be complementary. How the U.S. plans to protect the sustainability and future of climate finance in its developmental programming. And finally, how the U.S. plans to prioritize the localization of climate-specific programming in order to ensure a just transition. Clearly defining climate-specific development programming will no doubt foster deeper engagement with partner countries at COP26 to strengthen implementation planning, ensure that the strategy is closely aligned with the new nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans. International climate development is yet another way we can further deepen our ties with transatlantic partners in particular, and I welcome the opportunity to do so today. With that, I welcome an honest assessment of where we need to go in our pursuit of global climate development strategies with our expert witnesses. And I thank you, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have here today. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Keating. And our final opening statement is from Ranking Member Fitzpatrick.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Castro, Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Takis, and thank you to our panel of witnesses for being here as we discuss the upcoming 2021 UN Climate Change Conference and how the U.S. can collaborate with our international partners on shared climate objectives. Wildfires, storms, floods, and other extreme weather events continue to intensify around the globe. And since its first meeting in 1995, the conference of the parties has worked towards finding consensus solutions to global climate change. And I'm grateful to have leaders from our nation's foreign assistance agencies here to discuss their role in our foreign policy agenda at a time when we are facing unprecedented threats from a changing environment. And while the world looks to move forward with climate-oriented agendas, the United States and our allies must be mindful of the implications of countries like the People's Republic of China not doing their share when it comes to climate. Despite being the leading global emitter, the PRC has been allowed to make meager commitments to curb their emissions while undue burdens are placed on American taxpayers to make up for the Chinese Communist Party's deliberate failures. The reality of the CCP's lack of genuine action on climate needs to be factored into how we approach our climate policies. If they do not step up with their commitments, the actions we take and the money we spend could be offset by their exponentially larger emissions output. And meanwhile, the CCP will continue pouring money into their real priorities, increasing their position as a strategic competitor of ours. Another aspect of U.S. climate policy is to consider the impact of prohibitive benchmarks for our foreign assistance on developing nations. In countries where energy access is limited and that do not have the same resources as Western countries to rapidly transition to renewable or clean energy sources, it is unfair to impose that transition when increasing access to any and all energy sources should be the priority. The United States and our allies in the United Nations have benefited greatly over the years through adopting policies that take both the economy and the environment into consideration. However, developing nations may not have the same resources to endure the obstacles they will face adopting policies that meet aggressive carbon neutral goals. Much of the world continues to depend, unfortunately, on fossil fuels for powering their economies. Any transition will require patience, continued incorporation of energy sources like natural gas into our climate strategy, and serious advancements in renewable energy technology to be viable. And it's important to not let strategic competition pit our good intentions against our nation's security. European energy prices are up more than 5 times from a year ago, despite being one of the region's top regions for renewable use in the world. So in pursuing decarbonization, which is a very, very important priority of our country and the world, policymakers must balance longer-term environmental goals with protecting the very people and the very economies they are taking into consideration. It's my hope that our witnesses can explain how they will not lose sight of their agency's stated goals to address barriers to economic growth in exchange for pursuing political goals. These hurdles will prove challenging, but the end result can include a more equitable future and an avenue for the United States to continue to be the global leader in energy and environmental standards. So I thank the panelists for being here. Thank my colleagues for hosting this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick. Okay, let's get into the discussion. I'll now introduce our distinguished witnesses. We have with us today Mr. Gillian Caldwell, or Miss Gillian Caldwell, sorry, who is a climate change coordinator at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. USAID is the country's best resource development agency, and I look forward to hearing your testimony on the role it will play in our climate programs. We also have Mr. Jake Levine, who is the Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. The DFC, as our nation's newest development agency, has a lot of potential and interest on the Hill. I look forward to hearing how the DFC will use all its tools, including loans, loan guarantees, and equity investments in this climate challenge. Finally, we have Mr. Jonathan Richard, the Deputy Vice President for Infrastructure, Environment, and the private sector at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. The MCC is an agency that has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to get results for our development dollars, and I'm eager to hear how these capabilities will be brought to bear on climate. And just a note, both for our witnesses and also for the members as you're asking your questions, if you go to the grid view, you'll see the 5-minute clock. Please, for the witnesses, try to keep your opening remarks here to about 5 minutes. And once we get into the question and answer session for our members, if you can try as much as possible to keep your question and answer period to those 5 minutes. Don't think me rude if you go too long and I have to interject there, but we want to make sure that we have time for everybody to ask their questions today. All right. So first, I'll ask Ms. Caldwell with USAID to testify. Ms. Caldwell, please.
Chairman Castro, Chairman Keating, Ranking Members Malliotakis and Fitzpatrick, distinguished members of these subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify about U.S. efforts to combat the climate crisis. I am honored to be USAID's new climate change coordinator and deputy assistant administrator, overseeing a broad range of our environmental and conservation work. As an agency that stares down the world's toughest challenges, none poses a greater threat than climate change. The science is clear. We have a narrow window remaining to dramatically reduce global emissions, or we all face catastrophic consequences, with the most vulnerable populations getting hit the hardest. Even if the world bands together to cut emissions to net zero tomorrow, the impacts of climate change are upon us, from punishing storms and devastating floods to grueling droughts, extreme heat waves, and raging wildfires. Failure to act globally will have serious consequences locally. But climate change is not just an existential threat. It's a strategic opportunity for the United States. Expanding international markets for clean energy creates good job opportunities here at home. Working with communities overseas to adapt to climate change and improve economic opportunities addresses the core drivers of migration. President Biden has made addressing the climate crisis a top priority, and so it is for USAID. World leaders are set to convene at COP26 to update commitments made under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Existing pledges fall well short of what is needed. U.S. leadership in driving more ambitious climate commitments is absolutely critical. Equally as important, USAID partners with developing countries to make their climate commitments a reality on the ground through locally led development. Over the past 5 years, we helped mobilize over $118 billion in private investment in renewable energy capacity across 20 countries, including major emerging economies like India and South Africa. Our forest conservation programs have eliminated over 300 million tons of carbon emissions in places like Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin. That's the equivalent of removing 70 million cars from the road for an entire year. But even with these achievements, the climate crisis is sowing instability, jeopardizing hard-fought progress and the taxpayer dollars that Congress has invested in global development and security. Climate change is set to push 100 million people into poverty this decade and to displace over 1 billion by 2050. What will these people do and where will they go if climate change washes their homes away and dries up their lands and livelihoods? To reduce the risks of displacement, we partner with many of the world's most vulnerable to adapt and reduce climate risks, working with local farmers, national governments, and everyone in between to make food, water, health, and infrastructure systems more resilient. As the lead federal agency for international disaster assistance, we also work to improve disaster preparedness. Through our Servier partnership with NASA, we've helped more than 10 million people improve climate readiness through early warning systems and access to climate data and training. These investments save lives and money and make the United States more secure. Every dollar we invest in climate adaptation and preparedness over the next decade will yield at least 3 times the return in net benefits. To confront the climate crisis, USAID is developing an ambitious whole-of-agency strategy to guide our efforts through 2030. In the strategy, which we will be releasing for public comment at COP, we are setting our most ambitious timelines and targets ever for reducing global emissions, increasing adaptation, and mobilizing climate financing. We are also grounding our strategy in the principles of equity, inclusion, and locally led development. And we are doing our part through a series of internal reforms to reduce emissions from our operations, safeguard our facilities from climate risk, and improve the diversity of our workforce. Thank you to both of these subcommittees and to Congress for your support of USAID's climate efforts. We are so grateful for your ongoing partnership, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Caldwell. And now on to Mr. Levine with the DFC.
Thank you, Chairman Castro, Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Maliotakis, and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today and discuss with you the role of DFC in advancing the President's International Climate Finance Agenda. In his speech last month to the UN General Assembly, President Biden not only recognized the urgency of the climate crisis, but also reminded nations that making ambitious climate investments is a chance to invest in ourselves and our own future, to create good-paying jobs for workers, spur long-term economic growth, and foster healthier, more vibrant communities. DFC is well positioned to use its private sector investment tools to advance this vision. The President has recognized DFC's unique role and has called on DFC to do more. We are working with other G7 development finance institutions and US government agencies through the Build Back Better World initiative to increase the amount that we invest in climate solutions. Through B3W and in line with the Build Act, we will offer countries a positive vision and a sustainable, transparent alternative to coercive financing models driven by authoritarian governments. It is important to underscore that our climate efforts will continue to reflect a long-standing bipartisan focus on development. We aim to reach those that are poorest and most marginalized, and the needs of low-income countries for energy, for clean air and water, and for economic growth are at the forefront of our agenda. Doing all of this will require significant investments. According to the IFC, the climate financing gap for emerging markets amounts to roughly $1.5 to $2 trillion per year. The gap grows wider when you consider the costs of inaction, that climate change is projected to cost developing economies anywhere between 1.5% and 5% of GDP per year. Closing this gap will require significant private sector capital mobilization, but markets increasingly recognize that addressing this challenge also represents a tremendous opportunity for growth. We're looking at a $23 trillion global market in the clean energy transition by 2030, and DFC has a critical role to play in catalyzing these investments. To do so, we will draw from a suite of financial tools, including direct loans and project finance, insurance, equity and funds investments, and technical assistance funding. And to help close this gap, we have pledged that climate-linked projects spanning clean energy, agriculture and food security, buildings, transportation, and nature-based solutions for carbon removal will account for at least 33% of new investments beginning in FY23, and that by 2040, DFC's portfolio will be net zero for climate pollution, the most ambitious net zero target among G7 DFIs. By investing in climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, DFC will support US economic competitiveness. Our competitors around the world seek to lead in these areas not because they recognize the dangers of climate change, but because they want to win the clean energy industries of the future, and they are not waiting for the US to take the lead. They have already mobilized aggressively to dominate energy markets, whether it's for natural gas or photovoltaic cells. And while it is undeniable that China is an egregious polluter, the PRC also ranks first in the production of solar, wind, electric vehicles, batteries for grid storage, and hydropower. That's because clean energy is the driving economic force of the future. US leadership in climate is critical to achieving major strategic initiatives. Take India, a crucial partner in Asia, which is seeking to add 175 gigawatts of solar capacity by the year 2022 and 450 gigawatts by 2030. It is in our interest to support responsible, values-driven companies in achieving these goals. And with the private sector, we can provide an attractive financing option for developing countries, which dovetails with our domestic agenda to invest in American manufacturing, jobs, and clean energy businesses at home. Articulating a vision for development that centers climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience will require substantial and sustained investment. That's why President Biden announced at UNGA that the US would significantly ramp up our support for climate investment in developing economies, aiming for total public financing of $11.4 billion per year. This commitment will require not just careful budgeting, but also sustained support from the Congress. And thanks to bipartisan support in this and other key committees, DFC has already begun to dramatically scale its investments. We committed $6.7 billion to development projects in FY21, representing the largest annual investment by DFC or its predecessor in 25 years, and we're poised to keep growing. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about our efforts, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Levine, for your testimony. And now I'll call on Mr. Richard with the MCC.
Great, thank you. Chair Castro, Chair Keating, Ranking Member Maliotakis, and Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, distinguished members of the subcommittees, Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and our climate work. You have a copy of my written testimony, but I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight some of the main points here. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is an innovative and independent U.S. government development agency that partners with selected countries to reduce poverty through economic growth. Since 2004, MCC has invested $14 billion in more than 40 low and lower middle income countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. One of MCC's greatest strengths is our rigorous approach to data, monitoring and evaluation, and country ownership. Decisions on where we work, what sectors we focus on, are all driven by an evidence-based approach that is responsive to countries' needs and priorities. Both the evidence and our deep engagement with countries have pointed to the inextricable link between poverty, economic growth, and climate change. MCC partner countries are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, despite being the least responsible for it. For them, climate adaptation is not a luxury. It is a necessity. For MCC, investing in climate-smart development is key to ensuring our investments are sustainable and U.S. development dollars can have lasting impact. Without significant interventions, climate change, combined with the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, will reverse significant development gains made over the last 20 years and will exacerbate global poverty and inequality. The World Bank estimates that every dollar invested in climate-related infrastructure creates roughly $4 in economic benefits. In this context, investing in climate-smart development and sustainable infrastructure is critical to helping our partner countries enhance their resilience to future crises and to adapt to new climate realities. Fortunately, MCC was an early mover in integrating climate considerations into our programs. In fact, between 2015 and 2020, $1.7 billion, or about 40% of the agency's program funds, were in climate-related activities across a range of sectors. Whether upgrading design standards for roads to boost resilience against increased frequency and intensity of storms, as we did in the Philippines, considering the implications of sea level rise for ports as we develop our compact with Tunisia, or supporting renewable energy, energy efficiency, and policy reforms as we are in Benin, Ghana, and Burkina Faso, MCC has a strong track record making investments to help our partners address the impacts of climate change. In April this year, recognizing the impact climate change has on our mission, MCC committed to strengthening our work to help our partner countries address the challenges of climate change. This included a commitment to invest in climate-smart development and sustainable infrastructure, and to support our partner countries' efforts to address their own climate priorities. We have estimated that over the next 5 years, our climate-related investments will increase to at least 50% of our overall portfolio. To achieve this, MCC will work with partner countries to promote climate-smart development and sustainable infrastructure through our well-established model. MCC will ensure the long-term viability of these investments by remaining evidence-based and data-driven, as well as continuing to learn and listen to our country partners who are attuned to the risks posed by climate change. Country ownership is a central tenet of MCC's model, and our work on climate is no exception. Addressing climate change in our work and through our model is essential to ensuring our investments are sustainable and provide lasting results. A road can only spur economic growth and reduce poverty if it survives the storms that come its way. An irrigation system can only increase crop production if water is available. Understanding and preparing for future risks is essential to making sure that the economic benefits generated by MCC's investments are sustained over time. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on MCC's climate work, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. And I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. And pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between majority and the minority, and also alternating between the two subcommittees. I can only call on you if you're present with your video on. Please turn your video function on to gallery view so that you can see everyone else in the room. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And given the time constraints with this hearing, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be stricter with the 5-minute limit for questions so that every member gets an opportunity to participate. I'll start by recognizing myself for questions. So each of your agencies has a different role to play in our climate strategy on international development. I want to flesh that out just a little bit. And so my first question is for Mr. Levine and the DFC. The DFC is the United States' newest development agency and has a number of promising authorities. My question is, how do you see DFC's role as differentiated from USAID and MCC or other agencies? And what role do you see for loans, loan guarantees, and equity investments as a part of our international climate programs?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. And, I think among a few key differentiators, it's important to note that DFC works with the private sector, and we seek to scale commercially viable investments. One of the areas where we are continually exploring our ability to provide additionality in the development finance world is in climate, where we may seek to pursue more concessional loans. Our predecessor agency, OPIC, had a statutory mandate to return monies to the Treasury. Under the BUILD Act, DFC has a mandate to achieve an appropriate financial performance. And so we're in the process now of evaluating what appropriateness looks like in the context of climate. But I would say that our agencies they're quite neatly complementary. So where USAID has missions and local presence on the ground and is able to provide a real focus on grant financing and pipeline development, DFC is later able to come in and provide scale in terms of debt financing, equity financing, and really bring these projects to commercial viability. The other thing that I would just note is some of our tools are really innovative in this market as compared with the other DFIs. So we can provide long-term financing options where we can offer tenors of up to 10, 15, 20 years. And that's really unique in the market. We're also able to provide financing in local currency. It's a new authority that we're exploring, but it's key to being able to do projects in risky markets.
Oh, very good. No, thank you for that. A question for Mr. Richard. The MCC's work is heavily dependent on the mutual priorities of the United States and compact or partner countries. And this is a strength of the MCC model that allows partner countries to identify their own priorities. There's a perception that we're pushing climate-related work on our partner countries. And I want to get a sense for how true that is. What are you hearing from our partners on what they need from us on climate-related assistance?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your question. I want to underscore that we will continue to follow our model. This is a central tenet of MCC, and we actually believe our model is already well suited to incorporating climate change into our investments, having demonstrated that by our track record. I think as we look forward and when we look at our programs going forward, the countries and their interest in meeting their own climate goals and meeting their own nationally determined contributions ties nicely in with our model and our partnership with them as we work together to develop our programs. So our new commitments actually build on our model. We are not replacing our model or stepping away from our model as we look to further our climate goals. What we're doing is more systematically working with our country partners on their climate priorities. We're ensuring that all infrastructure that we build is climate resilient. And we're taking a hard look at our analytical tools, which is another hallmark of MCC in determining what we invest in to make sure that they're consistent with best practices in climate science and economics. Again, just reiterating, I feel this country partnership has served us well in the past, and we believe this is going to continue to serve us well as we move forward.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, I'm going to ask Ms. Caldwell a question just for the record because I've only got about 30 seconds left. But what do you see as USAID's strengths, especially given the growing prominence of other agencies in the development space? Given the scale of the emergency and USAID's potential to absorb and deploy additional funds to generate impact, what are USAID's budget needs to achieve your ambitious goals? And I'm just about out of time, so I'll just submit that question for you for the record. With that, I'll call on Ranking Member Maliotakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for your testimony. I guess I'll start with USAID and Ms. Caldwell. I understand that you're new to the entity, and so I'm not trying to blame you for stuff of the past, but I think we all need to learn from reports that come out, particularly those reports from inspector generals that show that taxpayer money has not been used wisely, or has been wasted, or has even been fraudulent. And I wanted to point to the recent SIGAR report regarding Afghanistan, which I've been currently going through. And I really urge all my colleagues on this committee to also examine it, because it's shocking to see the billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars that have been wasted, much of it from Department of Defense, paying for ghost armies and stuff like that. But also with regards to USAID, USAID spent $335 million on a diesel-powered electric plant for Kabul. At its maximum production, it ran at 2.2% capacity, but it really was running at less than 1%. So first of all, diesel obviously is not efficient or environmentally friendly. But aside from that, it's just the waste of this facility that was built and then sat there unused. What can we do as lawmakers, and what can you do in your capacity at USAID, and what measures is USAID taking to ensure that this type of waste is not occurring? I think, I hear a lot of numbers going around in these testimonies today, billions here, billions there, we spend billions. That's all, I think the taxpayer might not be so happy about that when they hear reports like this occurring. So I would just love to get some feedback from you and from the others on what we can do to ensure that this money's actually going where it's supposed to be going, and not being either stolen or wasted.
Thank you so much for that question. Corruption isn't just another item on a long list of global problems. It's a systemic and normative challenge in many places around the world, and it jeopardizes our ability to do our job. And that's the reason our administrator has made fighting corruption one of the very top priorities here at USAID. So, we're working side by side with a broad range of allies throughout the donor, multilateral, and interagency space. And we've supported the implementation of a range of key global partnerships, including the Open Government Partnership and the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, or EITI. I can't speak to the specifics of the investment that you cite in Afghanistan, although I'm happy to revert to you on that. But I will say that we place a real primacy, and absolutely with respect to this forthcoming climate strategy that will take us through 2030, we will place a lot of emphasis on monitoring and evaluation, because dollars are scarce and we can't afford to make investments that don't make any sense. Additionally,
and what kind of monitoring are you doing currently with these projects? What kind of metrics, what kind of reporting, checks and balances is USAID doing?
Yeah, so we have a team that it specializes in monitoring and evaluation, and we have very rigorous qualitative and quantitative metrics for each and every project that we undertake. And we provide training, support, and guidance to both the missions and our implementing partners in the field to ensure that they are in a position to report out on, on the work that's being done and our progress towards those metrics. And of course, that analysis informed how we thought about this strategy. We need to know what's working and what isn't, and where we have situations where we're underperforming, we need to address that, with rigor.
Okay. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Maybe I'll just chime in for MCC and reiterate that we also have very close oversight functions, rigorous field visits, regular engagement. We work very closely with our countries in partnership. We also have very strict procedures and processes to control the use of funds, ensure they're used properly in the intended use, and then similar to USAID, have a full team that has very rigorous monitoring and evaluation approaches. I'm happy to be able to share more if that would be of interest.
Thank you.
And likewise, we'll get back to you on your concern regarding the Afghan investment.
I appreciate it. I would love to hear what other measures, if you could send it to my office, the actions you're taking to ensure that doesn't happen in the future. Thank you, Chairman Castro.
Thank you, Ranking Member Malliotakis. We'll now go to Chairman Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'd like to tell the ranking member that I sponsored successfully an amendment in the NDAA, the Defense Authorization we just had, that extends the power, expands the power of the Special Inspector General on Afghanistan reconstruction. So that is in the works. We've done that in the House, and I'd like to make her aware of that, and that's being done. There's a common thread about today's testimony, about today's hearing that I hear, and I think it could be reflected in some of the questions today about the fact that the U.S. shouldn't move forward aggressively on climate change issues because other countries aren't moving ahead as much as we want them to and as much as we are. Yeah, I think it's akin to having your house catch fire on one end of the street and another catch fire at the other end of the street, and you're not putting out the fire in your house and protecting your immediate neighbors because you're not happy that the person at the end of the street's doing enough to protect their house. And I just want to address that because I think it's nonsensical as an argument. With that being said, however, there are issues that are intertwined in our response. And we're having trouble right now, amazing trouble in our economy with supply chains and what's occurring with our supply chain vulnerabilities. And this pours over into our area too. A good example of this, I think, is 80% of the world's solar panels are made in China. And a significant portion of those comes from Xinjiang. And that includes 45% of the world's polysilicon. And of course, that presents an enormous human rights issue, one that President Biden has taken steps to curtail in imports of solar technology coming from Xinjiang. But the work there presents climate concerns also because in their production of the solar panels, they're often powered by coal. So there are opportunities that exist to diversify these large supply chains, including developing regions like Africa, that we could be involved in. How have your agencies worked to encourage this diversification of rare earth mineral supply chains and a lot of these areas where there's a near monopoly by China? And how can we balance, the human rights and the just transition concerns and extraction of environmental impacts as well? If any of you could address that, that'd be great. I'd be grateful.
Maybe I'll jump in. Chairman Keating, thank you so much for this critical question. And I just want to begin by underscoring that the removal of forced labor from our supply chains is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. And we're looking at this issue from every angle, and we are committed to eliminating forced labor from the supply chains, both that we import into the United States and that we finance internationally. One immediate step that we've taken is we are not allowing any direct government financing for solar panel manufacturers who have been sanctioned for their use of forced labor or who are listed on the Customs and Border Protection Withhold Release Order limiting importation into the United States. But I also want to turn to this issue that you note about supply chain diversification, because DFC is quite uniquely and well positioned to work productively with our partners and allies around the world to invest in major opportunities for this type of diversification. In fact, we are now looking at a couple of investments that, given confidential business information, I'm not able to share publicly the names, but which are quite promising U.S. Solar manufacturing facilities located in the developing economies that we work in. We are actually partnering with USAID on an initiative to drive this discussion and potential development of such supplies in Africa, as you indicate, which represents a real opportunity. And then outside of the solar space, we recognize that as we look at supplies for cobalt, nickel, lithium, graphene, all critical minerals to the clean energy supply chains required for clean cars and battery storage.
Well, I apologize for interrupting, but the one thing that I will say as a comment and maybe a follow-up in a written form is the fact that those countries that do share our values, particularly our transatlantic allies, I think we have to work harder to coordinate and balance our efforts and have a multiplier effect with their investments and ours. I apologize, my time is running out. That's why I had to cut you off, and I yield back.
But absolutely looking forward to coordinating offline. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Keating. We'll go now to Representative Tenney.
Thank you, Chairman Castro and Chairman Keating, for this joint meeting and for our witnesses. I appreciate you being here. It's an important issue, and we need to work with our international partners to enhance our resilience and the impacts of climate change. Even though I don't come from a coastal region, I do have the Great Lakes in my sphere, so we have a lot of issues relating to that as well. I'm concerned, though, in doing so, that we continue to offer a realistic and pragmatic approach with actual results, something that shows that we're going to preserve open and free markets, as well as continuing to look at innovation that leads to prosperity, fewer emissions, and a more secure energy source in terms of getting prepared for the energy of the future. And also, as we look to tackling climate change, I wanted to make sure we have a level playing field that benefits U.S. interests. And so my first question is to Mr. Richard. And I know this was just alluded to briefly, but can you walk me through the due diligence on the supply chains for these climate-related energy projects, particularly related to the solar projects? I'm concerned about what's happening in China and whether there will be clean supply chains and that the so-called slave labor in the Xinjiang province will not be implicated in these projects. You alluded to it, or I believe Mr. Levine is. Could you detail how we're going to ensure that that doesn't happen? And that question is for Mr. Richard.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for your question. I think I would start with underscoring or start with some of the points Jake made in terms of being very aware of this issue, and we are working with other government agencies and with the administration for a broader solution to it. We do have in our procurement and tendering documents provisions on the use of forced labor in supply chains. However, as you referenced due diligence, that is an important piece of actually looking at what is occurring and what is coming through in that. In the immediate term,
sure. Go ahead. I'll jump in. Can you add in an enforcement of that provision? Is there a way to enforce that? And just add that to your question. Thank you.
Yes. In terms of enforcement, and this, we have mechanisms in our procurement for how we screen when firms do bid. They have to be screened. There's a rigorous evaluation process to evaluate the bids, looking at how they stack up with respect to the requirements in the specifications and the bidding documents. So, we have, I'll flag two things that we're doing right now, maybe three actually. One, we have looked at our portfolio to identify where we are supporting solar panels and where this might be an issue. Secondly, as we look at our procurement systems and processes, we do have those mechanisms in terms of the requirements. We follow up on those and we screen. And then thirdly, we are looking at how we specify in the types of equipment and materials that we need, sources that we believe would not encounter this issue.
And let me ask you, realistically, would these people be cut off? Would people engaging in slave labor type activities in the supply chain, would they be cut off from receiving the grants or receiving the money?
If those systems are in place and they work, frankly speaking, yes, we would not be procuring those kinds of panels. I will say that getting to those level into supply chains can be challenging and labor intensive just to kind of dig through that. But this too is why we're looking for a broader solution and working with the administration in that regard.
Great. I look forward to hearing more on that. I'm glad you're working on that. My next question is for Ms. Caldwell. Under USAID's Climate Readiness Plan, pursuant to the Executive Order 14008, it outlines ensuring a climate-ready workforce as a top priority. What does this mean in practice, and what is the cost associated with achieving this and the priorities outlined in the plan? If you could do, I just got less than a minute left. If you could give me a quick answer, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to respond more fully because that's a big question. I mean, needless to say, our workforce spans 80 countries around the world, and first and foremost concern is their safety and security. And this relates back to the very important work we do on climate adaptation and resilience. But the other factor here is the kind of technical expertise that we need right now. Because we're short of funding, we don't have the kind of environmental expertise that we very much need at a mission level in order to design and implement the programs. The people that are tagged within missions on a part-time basis to do our environmental analysis before we make investments have insufficient time, and in some cases require deeper training in order to be prepared to do their job well.
So training is going to be a major component of this.
Yeah, we want to upskill our existing workforce, but we also are going to need additional staff in order to do what needs to be done here. I'm happy to respond more fully to that question if you'd like.
Well, my time has run out, so it's up to the chairman, or we can exchange in writing or outside the committee.
Yeah, I meant in writing. I'll get back to you with more detail on this. So
no, great, thank you. I really appreciate the answer.
Okay.
But thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Representative Tenney. We'll go next to Brad Sherman. Okay, how about Congresswoman Houlihan? All right. Mr. Buser, is he on?
I'm here. This is Chrissy Houlihan.
Oh, go ahead.
Perfect. And I apologize. I wasn't expecting to be called quite so early. I was actually just reading an article while we were talking. It says White House intelligence agencies, Pentagon issues reports warning climate change threatens global security. My question has to do somewhat with that and the implications of migration patterns due to climate change and the impact that has on particularly women and girls. We know that cross-border displacement and migration really has captured a lot of high-profile global attention in recent years, and climate change has really emerged as one of the significant drivers of that forced displacement, which has been sending a lot of people from vulnerable areas to even to viable areas of their countries to build new lives. What should we as policymakers do to respond to the urgent needs of climate and crisis affected populations, particularly to address the disproportionate impact that is having on women and girls, and as a consequence on our national security? And I would love to throw that open to the panel.
I'll jump in briefly and allow my colleagues to respond as well. As I said in the opening statement, in order to stave off what could be waves of migration with an estimated 1 billion people facing homelessness as a result of the climate crisis over the next decades, we really have to invest in climate preparedness and resilience at a local level. And that is going to require additional support. Under the Trump administration, USAID saw significant cuts in its budgets for adaptation and resilience, and we really need to restore that support. As you also noted, climate change has very disproportionate impacts on women. In fact, women are 5 times as likely to be killed as a result of extreme weather events as men because of the poverty in which they live and the vulnerability they face as sort of the front lines in many families around the world. So, if we want to stave off the migration, we have to enable these communities to continue to live in dramatically changing local circumstances, and that requires investment. But I'll let my other colleagues respond as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in as well, and very much agree with my colleague in terms of the need for increased support for adaptation and resilience. And similarly, there's a need to ensure there's economic growth and opportunity in that context. And maybe just to give an example from one of our programs in Niger, where it is getting hotter. It's already water scarce, and we're working with them to help invest in irrigation infrastructure that helps adapt to that is more climate resilient, that improves management of water and natural resources to help them adapt to the changing climate realities.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add? I appreciate you and your insights, and I will yield back.
Thank you, Representative. We'll go next to Mr. Muser.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and thank you to our ranking members for all of you putting together this excellent panel. It's a very important and interesting conversation. Just a short time ago, the United States was energy independent while achieving really the largest decline in carbon emissions of any industrialized country on Earth. Certainly more than any other nation in the Paris Agreement. And a lot of that was due to our conversions to natural gas. We led the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, cutting energy related to CO2 emissions by 12% from 05 to 18, and the rest of the world increased emissions by 24%. And these trends absolutely need to continue. And it's by all means very much in our interests, in the interests of our existential interests, but it's just in the interests of society and the next generations. And I frankly am very, very pleased how the private sector is embracing this, both small businesses and large businesses, and finding an ROI along the way, which is good. So it really wasn't due to mandates or by signing pledges that the real problem that the problem countries aren't upholding. We're doing it through energy innovation, and natural gas from my home state of Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact, is a big contributor to our lowering of carbon emissions. So where I'm going with this is Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, of course, sits on a wealth of natural gas deposits. At one time, not too long ago, the Obama administration touted Africa's natural gas the key to providing reliable power to the 600 million population of Africa. So President Obama's energy secretary consistently advocated for natural gas to be the centerpiece of Africa's energy development and supported an all-of-the-above approach as a lead negotiator of the Paris Agreement. It is somewhat incredulous that the Biden administration would consider foreclosing on the opportunity to export America's energy success and technology to Africa and build up a domestic energy sector on the continent, call it transitional, create thousands of jobs in poverty-stricken countries, and develop natural gas-based fertilizers to boost African agriculture. Ms. Caldwell, I'll ask you, does USAID believe that lower emitting fuels like natural gas should continue to play a role in these development initiatives, projects of USAID, especially in Africa, where its full impact would be significant for the economy, agriculture, as well as perhaps healthcare? Ms. Caldwell.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for that question. The first thing I'd point out is that 95% of our funding is designed to support renewable energy via a congressional renewable energy earmark. So, we obviously are following that earmark and making substantial investments in renewable energy. In addition to that, it's worth noting that in 2/3 of the country where we work, new clean energy generation is now cheaper than fossil fuel generation. And of course, we have an interest in ensuring that our development dollars are going as far as they can. In many cases, we are helping our local partner countries develop competitive auctions to procure renewable energy at the most at the most efficient rates. And those auctions are auctions in which the United States has an opportunity to compete. As Mr. Levine spoke about in his opening statement, China is substantially out investing us in
I'm sorry, Ms.
energy
Caldwell.
sources of the future.
Thank you. I just want to get a question, Ms. Levine. Ms. Levine, quickly, do you and the DFC plan to stop financing natural gas projects in developing nations?
No.
Great. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muser. I'm going to go to Ms. Vanberger next, but just to let everybody know, I got to go to an Intelligence Committee meeting for an important topic there in just a second, and I'll be turning over the chair to Chairman Keating. Ms. Vanberger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. In addition to serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I serve on the House Agriculture Committee, and I chair the subcommittee on conservation and forestry. So I have been especially focused on bringing farmers and producers to the table and expanding efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change via agriculture. Agriculture and land use practices can sequester carbon for as little as $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, making it the most cost-effective carbon sequestration method currently available. Meanwhile, nature-based climate solutions could account for as much as 30% of the total greenhouse gas reductions needed to meet the 2-degree warming goal set out by the Paris Climate Accords. Implementing and rewarding climate-friendly practices in agriculture can bolster resilience and farmers' profits within the United States, but they should also be part of a climate change mitigation and international development strategy plan that we pursue in communities around the globe. So, Ms. Caldwell, my first question is for you, and I'm curious, how is USAID working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture or any other relevant parts of the interagency to test and scale climate smart practices that can benefit farmers and producers and the communities where they are impacted by climate change around the world?
Thank you so much for that question. We couldn't agree with you more on the importance of nature-based solutions. We have a very strong program in that area that focuses on conserving, managing, and restoring nature-based terrains. Just by way of example, in the critically important carbon sinks of Amazon and the Congo Basin, we launched the Guerrilla Coffee Alliance with USAID, Nespresso, and Olam. And we're going to invest a combined $14 million over 5 years to support sustainable agriculture. We have a Cocoa for Climate initiative that's critically important to avoid deforestation in the cocoa industry, another private-public partnership. With the FAO, I'll have to get back to you on USDA specifically. Certainly with the FAO, we've also got another partnership, a forest data partnership. We collaborate with the State Department as well as Unilever and Google and NASA on this to incentivize private investment for natural climate solutions through very transparent data to help decision makers decide where and how to invest. With apologies that I don't have the specifics on USDA, I will note that for the record and make sure to get back to you. I am aware that we work very extensively with the U.S. Forest Service, which is, of course, a part of USDA, and a number of our funds are redeployed directly through the USDA when it comes to forest management overseas.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caldwell. And as follow-up, I would love to get any details that you all might have about some of the anticipated benefits, kind of long range in terms of mitigating climate change, but then also the impact on the ground for the local producers and what these sustainable practices mean for them. So
Absolutely.
We talked about the positive side of really addressing climate change in the agriculture space, but we also know that analysis indicates that climate change has really dire consequences for many farmers and producers and those who rely on agriculture for their sustenance of life. And in some cases, we've seen the significant just depletion and lack of profitability of intergenerational farms, small and large. And in some cases, this loss of livelihoods has really contributed to the decision of many to consider migrating. So specific, and I would ask specifically about Latin America, but I welcome you in the limited time we have left to expand beyond that. How much in your work, have you seen that one of the root causes of migration is climate change related, or the impact of climate change on livelihoods?
We're absolutely seeing that. And I think when it comes to the Northern Triangle, that's a perfect example. I was reading a recent report by private players. And in fact, I believe a report's being released today by the administration on which we collaborated, which really connects the question of migration to the climate change. So we're working to address climate and non-climate drivers of mobility in vulnerable contexts and to support migrants and displaced peoples. That takes various forms. Focusing on food security is critical, as is water security. Making sure people have the advanced notifications they need to prepare for extreme weather events or other impacts on local agriculture and lifestyles. I mentioned earlier our collaboration with NASA on this innovative Severe program that helps provide early warning systems for natural hazards. As for the new climate migration report that I mentioned, that's really worth looking at. It's basically a very close analysis of the climate crisis, migration, and development, and it provides recommendations to help guide U.S. policy in that area. So, we coordinated the drafting of the session that discusses proposals for how those findings should address U.S. foreign assistance and our opportunities to work with host governments and communities to predict and prepare for the kinds of disasters that drive migration. So, as you're fully aware, based on your question, there's a very direct relationship between climate change and migration, and it's in our interest as well as local communities' interest to make sure that they have the capability to withstand those shocks and stay in place and survive and thrive.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caldwell. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting us go over. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Kim of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Caldwell, I wanted to just start with you here. I guess I wanted to just ask you, what is the Biden administration's measure of success for COP26?
Oh, I'm off mute already. Hi. Thank you so much for that question. First and foremost, as I alluded to in my opening statement, the primary goal at COP is really to increase global ambition and action on climate change, because the existing commitments under the NDCs are insufficient to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees or less. So Special Envoy Kerry and his team at State have been very actively involved, of course, in those global negotiations. I think they've achieved some early but still too modest wins with respect to urging China to increase its ambitions. There have been recent discussions with Indonesia. And as we head in, I think part of the reason that President Biden made the commitment that he did to increase climate finance to $11.4 billion per year commencing in 2024 is that the U.S. has fallen far behind other industrialized nations in providing the climate finance necessary to enable the many countries around the world who are prepared to step up.
If you don't mind me asking, like from a USAID standpoint, what are you going to be looking for the most? What is it that you would like to see come out of there? What can help your mission significantly?
Well, I mean, we share the administration's goal of making sure that we get increased commitments on nationally determined contributions and national action plans. I mean, that's the sort of holy grail of this meeting. But very importantly, we want to continue to forge the relationships that we have and need to expand on the ground to ensure that those commitments become a reality. I mean, all too often commitments sound good, but don't come to fruition, and that's where our on-the-ground presence can be so critically important in supporting these countries to deliver.
I'm thinking about that in conjunction with, what's in your testimony. You talk about this new strategy that's going to guide your activities through 2030, centered on two strategic objectives. The first one, addressing the most immediate demands in the here and now for supporting the most vulnerable communities suffering climate impacts today and helping fast-growing emerging economies make big cuts in emissions. I guess I want to ask you, what are those most vulnerable communities? Kind of give me a sense of how you're calculating that, how you're determining prioritization there.
Yeah, that's important. Let me give you a little more flavor for our strategy overall. So we have our direct action category, which includes emission reductions, building resilience, mobilizing finance, and to your question, partnering with Indigenous people, women and children, and an overall priority and principle on ensuring equity and inclusion. So, there are many historically underrepresented groups when it comes to development. And, we are taking a careful look to see how we can reallocate resources to ensure the most marginalized groups are given the agency and opportunity to articulate themselves and to help shape the solutions.
I wanted to dig in here though, because as you're saying, it's about supporting the most vulnerable communities. How are you calculating that? Are you actually developing up a list here based off of metrics? Just trying to get a sense of how you are going to understand what your benchmarks are for achieving that strategic objective you laid out.
Let me check back with the agency to see precisely how those measures are defined.
If you don't mind,
I don't know
because
to hand,
I would
but
like to get a sense of that, because it's framed as a new strategy here, and I guess my question to you is, was USAID not doing this before? That these objectives seem pretty straightforward to me about trying to prioritize those that are the most vulnerable. So I guess I'm just trying to say, is this actually new?
Yeah, well, what's new is that our last strategy took a targeted look at a few specific actions and places where we needed to intervene, whereas our new strategy is a whole of agency response, calling on each and every mission and each and every bureau to figure out how climate change can be mainstreamed into their programming and design. Our partners in the Bureau for Education, for example, are looking at the opportunity to upskill youth in green jobs and training. And they have an earmark which requires them to focus on education, of course, but there are creative ways to ensure that climate is central to the work we're doing across the board.
Well, I look forward to following up. Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct my question to Ms. Caldwell. And it has to do with the Amazon rainforest, which of course is often referred to as the lungs of the earth because of its crucial role in sustaining human life and biodiversity across the globe. We know that under the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, deforestation has surged to record highs as the government has rolled back environmental protections, emboldened those engaging in illegal logging and mining, and has grossly attacked the rights of indigenous communities, which is as big a concern for me as the ecological considerations. Previously, President Biden and the administration had signaled their interest in trying to negotiate an agreement with the Brazilian government aimed at reducing deforestation. And I had the opportunity to ask Secretary Kerry about this at a past hearing, and specifically about the role of the indigenous communities, or the lack thereof, in these negotiations. Can you provide us with any updates regarding the status of the negotiations and any efforts to include indigenous communities in negotiating any potential agreement?
I'd need to refer you to the State Department for updates on those negotiations. I was in a meeting recently with Senator Kerry where he talked about the firm commitment to ensure that Indigenous peoples are consulted and are key to shaping the solutions to the problems that we confront. And of course, Indigenous peoples, steward almost 25% of our opportunity for carbon sinks globally. They're just critically important, and that's why they will be a focus in our strategy. I mean, interestingly, when it comes to Brazil, we would obviously share your concerns with respect to what's happening there, but the protected areas where USAID is working saw a 50% reduction in deforestation in 2020, which is, of course, a contrast to the overall trends in the country. And I think what that demonstrates is the opportunity to work at the subnational level, even in complicated national environments, to achieve change. We have a strong relationship with the Chico Mendes Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, which manages protected areas throughout the country, and the National Indigenous Foundation, which manages Brazil's indigenous territories. We find that even in difficult geopolitical environments, because of our longstanding relationships on the ground, and we'll be celebrating our 60th birthday soon, in fact, on November 3rd, we are able to sustain progress, which is critically important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I hope you will take back the sense of this committee that it is very important to include those indigenous communities in all negotiations, and they must have a seat at the table. In the interest of time, I want to go on to my second question, which is also to you, Ms. Caldwell. In April, President Biden committed to doubling U.S. financial support for helping developing nations tackle the global climate crisis. When it comes to the Green Climate Fund specifically, what level of commitment does the U.S. expect from allies and partners around the world at COP26? And how specifically has the administration worked to encourage others to make strong pledges?
That question I will definitely need to get back to you in consultation with our allies at state, because I don't know how they've pegged those commitments. I know we're looking through our state and USAID investments combined to something in the neighborhood of $1 billion. But I need to revert to you on the specifics of what we're expecting from other nations.
And secondly, on technology transfer, do you have any updates on the U.S. strategy to foster international cooperation regarding innovation and technology to address the climate crisis, especially on advanced nuclear, industrial decarb, and carbon capture and zero emission vehicles? Do you have any updates on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about that is that we tend to feel that our dollars are not well spent in, in investing in more advanced and in some cases more speculative technologies. The level of investment required, for example, and already committed where it comes to carbon capture and sequestration has been so substantial, our budgets won't allow for it. So we focus on really creating the enabling environments for technologies that are ready to scale, solar being a perfect example, although we don't ourselves procure solar panels in almost any instances as far as I'm aware. So I don't think you'll see us investing heavily in emerging technologies historically or presumably moving forward, although again, it depends very much what Congress is prepared to allocate when it comes to our budget next year. And as we mentioned, we took a big hit. In fact, we're still working with Obama era level funding. And of course, this crisis has substantially increased in speed and in severity since then.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I direct this question to Mr. Reichert. You mentioned in your testimony about the Millennium Challenge Corporation in Mongolia, what they're doing there. We know that climate change often brings about demographic changes. And what's happening with the zoo in Mongolia is forcing so many people around the country to move to the capital, Ulaanbaatar. We can imagine that certain drastic climate events will force that kind of movement in other places. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the Mongolian water supply is dealing with all this movement of people into a concentrated urban area.
So thank you, Congresswoman, for your question. This is this is an important point, and this is certainly something that, as we developed our program in Mongolia with our Mongolian partners, that is indeed one of the stresses being placed on the water supply. I think there was reference in my written testimony to the efforts we are taking with our Mongolian partners to recycle industrial wastewater and looking at policy reforms. But the program also includes a significant component, which is investing in actually drinking water for Ulaanbaatar, for the capital city, drawing from groundwater in a sustainable way and actually protecting the upstream watershed. So this is part of an overall plan, working with the government as they look into the future and look at the increasing pressures that will be placed on their water supply, given the population in Ulaanbaatar. But this is absolutely a central piece of our program.
I know the Desert Research Institute in Nevada is working with you on some cloud seeding, predictability of snow in the mountains. That's because of the herds that come down, all of that sort of thing. Do you think you've set up a program that can be transferred to other places that experience this kind of migration, or is this just a one-off for Mongolia?
So I would say, broadly speaking, we try to learn from everything that we do and try to apply those lessons to other programs, and that is something we've done throughout our history. That's one of the advantages of having such a rigorous monitoring and evaluation component. It allows us to be able to draw those kind of experiences and look at the data and then apply that elsewhere. In terms of the specific situation in Mongolia, I would have to get back to you on details there. We are early on in the program, but if you're interested in additional specifics, would be happy to follow up in writing.
Thank you. I think it'd be something that we can anticipate happening in other places. It'd be good to kind of have a plan. So I'll talk to DRI folks too. My second question is to Mr. Levine, and this is about the South Pacific. We heard in a previous hearing about how there's need for the U.S. to be more engaged in helping with resiliency and climate change problems in this area of these islands, and how China is only too ready to move in. You can anticipate a hurricane, they'll move in, they'll never move out. Can you talk about the Development Finance Corporation, finance cooperation, and how maybe that needs more flexibility to allow us to use this soft power and move in there and give some help?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman, for the important question. And you're spot on that these are nations and islands that are quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And that really has just been coupled by the significant economic hardship that a number of the Pacific Island nations have faced as a result of the COVID impact. We're really interested in doing work in this area. We recently committed a loan portfolio guarantee to Papua New Guinea, which will mobilize $5 million around financial inclusion projects. And we're working on a Trans-Pacific Network subsea cable to provide connectivity to Palau. I will say DFC is somewhat limited in its ability to really engage in this region because, as you know, under the BUILD Act, we are focused on developmental transactions in low income and low to middle income countries. And many of the countries in which DFC is actually could be open for business in the Pacific are high income, upper middle income or high income countries. And a number of those industries are dominated by sectors such as tourism, where we just don't see a great development impact. So we would love to work together to achieve certain flexibilities whereby we could do more work in the Pacific. We recently we're pursuing investment agreements with Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, and we think that those are promising new opportunities. But I think working together, we can do more.
I just say it so you don't say it.
Mr. Chairman, maybe we could look into how we could grant a little more flexibility or work with the DFC. Thank you very much.
It's a great point. Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Representative Phillips from Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings, colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses. So glad we're doing this. It is a shame that 4 years past were wasted on this important initiative, and we can no longer look at it as just domestic policy. You all know that better than I, and I'm pleased that we're discussing how to engage the international community and use our resources to do so. My question is to you, Mr. Richard, my first one. I was really pleased to see in your testimony that MCC invested $14 billion in grant funding to, I think it was 40 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And my question is, do you view these compacts as direct alternatives to Chinese investment?
So thank you for your question, Mr. Congressman. I appreciate the interest and the support for our work and looking at the portfolio. I think, we're really focused on our singular mission of economic growth and poverty reduction through economic growth. And we have, there's been a lot of talk about our model, but I'll talk a little bit about some of our standards in that, in terms of environment and social standards as well. So I think what I would say, when you talk about an alternative to China, I think what we focus on is how we do our programs well, how we do our programs to a certain standard, to environmental standards, social standards, and how we might do it as an alternative or differently than perhaps others such as China might.
I appreciate that. My question, a little deeper is, how the U.S. can grow investment and partnerships in countries around the world to promote healthier and viable alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. That's my broader question, and I hope we can cover that at some point. I'd like to move to Mr. Levine, if I could. Other nations' development financial institutions, of course, make equity investments as part of their international development finance efforts, and I think they show good returns. I know DFC's equity investments are treated more like grants than they are loans. And my question is how this approach, how we score equity investments hurts our ability, I assume it does, to respond to the climate crisis. Could you address that?
Yes, and let me also just, if you'll allow me just to briefly comment on your first question, and note that under the president's leadership and with partnership in the G7, we are working closely alongside USAID and MCC on a Build Back Better for the World initiative, which really is designed to assert, American values and presence, particularly in the transactions, the highly strategic transactions where you see a Chinese activity and dominance in these key markets overseas, and we see that as a key part of what we're doing.
Wonderful.
The equity question that you ask is also relevant to that, because a number of development finance institutions, not just those dominated through the Belt and Road Initiative, are quite flexible in their ability to provide equity financing, which allows for greater de-risking of investments in very challenging markets, which is, of course, our core mission, to crowd in private investment. You noted we have a challenge in terms of our scoring. The way that we score our debt investments essentially allows us to leverage greater U.S. Treasury funding from the program appropriations that Congress provides to DFC, and that has allowed us over time to really scale our investments and actually return money to the U.S. Treasury. On the equity side, these are viewed as sort of automatic losses. So any project that, say we do a $5 million investment, as we just announced, in an equity transaction for a solar as a service company in Nigeria, that's $5 million that is out of our appropriations.
Exactly.
And we're not able to actually scale, not only in direct equity investments, which is a big part of our climate plans in the future, but also really importantly, to participate in funds investments, which we see as another way to really diversify our portfolio and scale. So we would be grateful for your help in thinking about this issue. I know there have been some discussions at the staff level, and eager to follow up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Levine, and I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Chair, to take heed of that and do our best to address it. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Oh, if time allows, I had a response as well, but.
Oh, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Unanimous. We'll another 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. I was just going to say that, with respect to China, USAID is helping to close regulatory, legal, and policy loopholes as well as weaknesses in the financial sector that really allow China to exert influence and undermine governance. And we'll continue to draw on that kind of comparative advantage by distinguishing our investment approach to China's, ensuring that good governance and sustainability and social economic safeguards are really built into the projects that we support.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caldwell. And now I re-yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Schneider from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, and I want to thank you and the whole committee for hosting this important hearing as the International Committee prepares for the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. I also want to thank the witnesses for sharing your time with us today. The stakes we're working against are not abstract. They're very real for every single American, as we've seen year after year. And we don't have to look very far or wide to find the impact of climate change and the effects it's having. Last year was the most active Atlantic hurricane season ever, with 29 named storms. In 2019, we saw the first ever extreme red flag warning for wildfires. Right now, as we speak, wildfires are actively raging across more than 6 million acres in the western United States. In my own community, we have experienced several so-called 100-year floods just in the past decade. Within only a few years, we have seen both record high and record low lake levels in Lake Michigan. And we continue to see recent years land among the highest average heat and precipitation levels in the region. Beyond our country, climate change is affecting virtually every corner of the globe and every aspect of our lives. Mr. Reichert rightly notes that parts of the world least responsible for emitting greenhouse gases are most at risk from the effects of climate change. But the consequence of climate change, including food insecurity, economic instability, disease prevention, and health system failures and forced migration, put all nations and all peoples at risk. The work by each of the agencies represented today is vitally important to address these challenges. But it's not enough to just respond to the effects of climate change. We have to work to affect the causes of climate change. That's why the Paris Agreement and doing everything we can to achieve its goals is so important. In advance of COP26, late next week, I will be introducing a resolution reaffirming U.S. commitment to international climate cooperation. I welcome all my colleagues to join me as original co-sponsors of this important legislation. Now to my questions, let me just open to the panel. In what way are the stakes of the International Climate Conference this year, COP26, different than in past conferences?
I'm happy to jump in,
Sure.
having attended a handful of these conferences in the past, most recently with the U.S. delegation in 2009, President Obama in Copenhagen. And I think I would just note, there is a broad recognition that we are entering a decisive decade on climate, and we see tremendous global alignment around that recognition. And I think if we were able to get that recognition at this COP, which any type of agreement requires unanimous consent by the UNFCCC rules, that would be a critical recognition. But we understand that the window, as you've pointed out in your opening remarks, for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is narrowing, and we're running out of time. And I think that this year is different in the sense that many countries recognize that and are willing to put ambition forward, to put financing forward, and our goals are to enhance that and increase that and work together with our partners in doing so.
Great, thank you. Ms. Caldwell, let me turn to you. You mentioned in your opening testimony that existing country pledges fall short of what we need to rein in climate change. Can you touch on maybe how we close the gap, but more significantly, why U.S. leadership is so important and how we need to make sure we empower our president as he heads to COP26?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. To put it simply, it costs money to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It's competitive relative to building new fossil fuel infrastructure, but that doesn't mean there aren't costs entailed in creating the underlying grids and getting the panels installed and up on the roofs and so forth. There's also, the work required to rebuild after extreme weather events and to rebuild in ways that are climate resilient, so that these communities can, continue to live in often threatened environments. So, as Senator Kerry has emphasized, and as President Biden acknowledged at the UN General Assembly in quadrupling our commitment after a lapse under the Trump administration, we would be nowhere in our negotiations if the US had not stepped up and made that very substantial contribution to increasing finance. Developing economies are understandably concerned that we haven't met our $100 billion pledge made at COP.
And how important, just to build on that, how important is it for Congress, and this is for everybody, that Congress passed the Build Back Better Act as the U.S. tries to help lead in the global fight to beat back climate change?
We're obviously supportive of the Build Back Better Act. I mean, this is a time to act boldly and in very significant ways. And, we appreciate President Biden's leadership thus far in that area. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that.
Mr. Reichert, you want to add to that, Mr. Levine?
I would just agree. I mean, as we talk about, the work that we've laid out, at the end of the day, it does require, resources to carry these things out. And, as I speak just for, MCC's own appropriations, we're able to do more with additional funding, and it's important to follow through on this. And I would just underscore, I think both of my colleagues have noted the collaboration, both in terms of the Build Back Better world across the interagency, but I think we're seeing that as well in the preparations for COP and in the coordination to really jointly together work to address the climate change.
Okay, and for DFC, Mr. Levine?
I really appreciate the question, because not only are we, of course, supportive of the infrastructure packages under consideration in the Congress, but it's important to note that when we talk about U.S. international development financing and the possibility for that to support U.S. manufacturing, U.S. jobs, strong businesses here at home, that work is complementary to the work that you all are doing to enhance domestic capabilities, and that will only enhance our competitiveness overseas when we look at these markets.
Thank you, and I know I'm over time. Chairman, thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Thank you. Time for member questions is now concluded. I want to thank the members for the thoughtfulness and the tenor of their questions, as well as their suggestions. I want to thank our witnesses for your time that you've given us so graciously, and really reinforcing the fact that climate change issues are inextricably related to your missions and the goals that you have for your organizations, and the importance of doing that. So thank you so much for being part of this. For the committee members, you'll have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitation of the rules. And I want to again thank everyone for their participation here this morning on a very important topic that I'm sure we'll be pursuing in many other venues. With that, I will call the hearing adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting.